Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we break down the moments that shaped civilizations, one battle at a time. Today, we're diving into some of history's most lopsided battles, those incredible, almost unbelievable moments when one side absolutely dominated the other, despite what should have been overwhelming odds. Now, you might think, well, obviously, the bigger, stronger army always wins. But history? It has a funny way of proving us wrong. Throughout time, we've seen smaller, outnumbered, or even technologically inferior forces completely crush their opponents. How? Through sheer tactical brilliance, superior positioning, leadership, or sometimes just the mistakes of their enemies. In this video, we're going to analyze some of the most famous examples of lopsided battles, those where one side won decisively, even though they should have lost. We'll break down what went right, what went wrong, and what these battles can teach us about military strategy. So strap in, because this is not just a list of battles, this is a lesson in warfare, power, and the unexpected ways history unfolds. Now, let's get started with our first example. In the year 60 AD, the Roman Empire faced one of its greatest threats in Britain, the rebellion of Boudicca, the warrior queen of the Iceni. She led an army of up to 230,000 warriors, determined to drive the Romans out. And at first, she was unstoppable, burning Roman settlements to the ground, wiping out entire garrisons, and striking fear into the heart of the empire. But then came the Battle of Watling Street, where the Romans, despite being outnumbered nearly 20-1, turned the tide in one of the most stunning military victories in history. So, how did a Roman force of just 10,000 soldiers defeat an army so massive it should have crushed them? Tactics, discipline, and the perfect battlefield. The Roman commander, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, knew he couldn't win in an open field. So he picked the perfect spot, a narrow defile, flanked by dense forests. This meant Boudicca's massive force couldn't surround them, forcing her warriors into a tight bottleneck where their numbers became useless. Then, when the Britons charged, the Romans stood firm in their legendary formations, hurling volleys of javelins that cut through the charging warriors. And when the time was right, they advanced in a tight wedge formation, slicing through the disorganized Britons like a knife through butter. Panic set in. The Britons, packed together with nowhere to run, collapsed in on themselves. The Roman cavalry moved in, cutting down thousands as Boudicca's army tried to flee. When the dust settled, tens of thousands of Britons were dead or captured, while the Romans, they barely lost a man. This battle didn't just save the Roman hold on Britain, it ended Boudicca's rebellion entirely. And it was yet another brutal lesson in why Roman military discipline made them one of the greatest forces in history. It is the year 1415, and England and France are locked in the 100 Years' War. The English king, Henry V, finds himself deep in enemy territory, leading an army that is exhausted, starving, and outnumbered at least 3-1. The French are confident this should be an easy slaughter. But what unfolds at Agincourt is one of the most stunning upsets in medieval warfare. The English had just 6,000 men, mostly lightly armored archers wielding the deadly longbow. The French? They had 20 to 30,000, including thousands of heavily armored knights, the elite of European warfare. But superior numbers mean nothing if you fight on the wrong battlefield. Henry chose his ground perfectly. The battlefield was narrow, bordered by thick forests that prevented the French from using their numbers to outflank him. And most importantly, it had rained heavily the night before, turning the open field into a thick, muddy mess. Then came the attack. The French knights, weighed down by their armor, charged across the mud, and it was a disaster. They slipped, fell, and got stuck in the thick sludge, making them easy targets for English archers, who rained down arrows in deadly, relentless volleys. When the French finally reached the English lines, they were exhausted and disorganized. The English, despite their smaller numbers, held firm, cutting them down with swords, axes, and maces. The narrow battlefield turned into a bottleneck. French soldiers at the back kept pushing forward, crushing their own men under the weight of their charge. By the end of the battle, thousands of French knights and soldiers lay dead in the mud, while the English suffered only a few hundred casualties. It was a complete annihilation, proving that terrain, tactics, and weaponry could matter far more than sheer numbers. And so, Henry V, with his ragtag army of longbowmen, secured one of England's greatest victories, humbling the mighty French knights in the process. Fast forward to the 19th century, and warfare has changed dramatically. In 1898, on the banks of the Nile River, one of the most lopsided battles in history takes place, one that showcased the brutal power of modern industrial warfare. On one side, the Mahdiist forces of Sudan, around 50,000 strong, armed with swords, spears, and outdated rifles. On the other, the Anglo-Egyptian army, a force of 26,000, commanded by General Herbert Kitchener, and equipped with the deadliest weapons of the age. The key to this battle? The Maxim machine gun. As the Mahdiist warriors charged, they were met with a level of firepower they had never encountered before. The British and Egyptian forces unleashed devastating volleys of artillery, rifle fire, and, most importantly, machine gun rounds that mowed down entire ranks of charging soldiers. This wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Mahdiist forces suffered around 25,000 casualties, while the Anglo-Egyptian army, they lost about 400 men. This battle didn't just secure British control over Sudan, it was a stark warning to the world. Traditional armies could not stand against modern firepower. Cavalry charges, swords, and raw numbers were now obsolete against machine guns, artillery, and disciplined formations. The Battle of Underdog wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration of how industrial warfare would define the coming century. Now, let's go back over 2,000 years to one of the most brilliant tactical victories in history, a battle so devastating that it nearly brought Rome to its knees. We're talking about the Battle of Cannae, fought in 216 BC during the Second Punic War. On one side, the mighty Roman Republic, fielding an army of nearly 86,000 men, one of the largest forces they had ever assembled. On the other, Hannibal Barca, the brilliant Carthaginian general, leading just 50,000 troops, many of them Gauls, Iberians, and African mercenaries. The Romans should have crushed him. Instead, they walked straight into one of the greatest military traps ever devised. Hannibal knew he couldn't win a head-on fight, so he did something genius. He positioned his army in a crescent formation, putting his weakest troops, the light infantry, in the center, with his strongest forces, his cavalry and seasoned African veterans, on the flanks. The Romans, eager for a decisive victory, charged straight at the Carthaginian center, thinking they were breaking through. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. His troops in the center gradually fell back, not in retreat, but in a controlled, deliberate withdrawal, luring the Romans deeper and deeper into the trap. Then came the moment of disaster for Rome. As the Roman legions pushed forward, Hannibal's flanks swung inward, surrounding them on three sides. And just when the Romans realized they were trapped, Hannibal's cavalry, having crushed the Roman horsemen, swung around and sealed the trap from behind. The Roman army was completely encircled. For hours, the Carthaginians methodically cut down tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. There was nowhere to run, no way to maneuver. It was absolute annihilation. By the end of the battle, between 50 and 70,000 Romans lay dead or captured, including some of Rome's most senior commanders. The psychological impact was immense. This was more than just a loss, this was a humiliation. Rome, the most powerful republic in the ancient world, had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and completely destroyed in a single battle. Even though Hannibal didn't march on Rome immediately after, Cannae remained a legendary example of tactical brilliance, a masterclass in how an inferior force could use strategy and deception to utterly destroy a larger enemy. Now, let's jump to the American Civil War, a time when industrialized warfare was beginning to reshape battle tactics, but not everyone had adapted. The year is 1864, and Union General Ulysses S. Grant is leading the Overland Campaign, determined to crush the Confederate Army and bring an end to the war. But then comes Cold Harbor, one of the bloodiest and most lopsided disasters for the Union Army. Here's what happened. Grant, aggressive as always, believed he could break through the Confederate defenses with one massive frontal assault. The problem? The Confederates, under General Robert E. Lee, had dug in deep, building an elaborate network of trenches, earthworks, and fortified positions. So when Grant ordered thousands of Union soldiers to charge straight at the entrenched Confederate lines, it was nothing short of a massacre. The Confederates were ready, and as the Union forces advanced, they were met with relentless rifle fire, artillery blasts, and volleys of lead that shredded their ranks. In just 1 hour, nearly 7,000 Union soldiers lay dead or wounded, their bodies piling up in front of the Confederate defenses. By the time the battle was over, Union casualties had reached around 12,000, while the Confederates lost only about 4,000. It was a one-sided bloodbath that accomplished nothing for the Union. This battle shattered morale among Grant's troops. Many Union soldiers, knowing they were being sent into a slaughter, sewed their names and addresses onto their uniforms, so their bodies could be identified when they fell. But Cold Harbor wasn't just a tragedy, it was a harsh lesson in modern warfare. It showed that charging entrenched positions head-on was suicide, and that tactics needed to evolve in the face of new defensive technologies like rifled muskets, trenches, and rapid-fire artillery. And Grant? He never made the same mistake again. After Cold Harbor, he abandoned costly frontal assaults and instead relied on maneuver warfare, a strategy that would ultimately bring the Civil War to an end. Now, let's talk about the shortest war in history. A war so lopsided, it was over before most people even realized it had started. This is the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, a conflict that lasted somewhere between 38 and 45 minutes. Yes, you heard that right, less than an hour. So what caused this blink-and-you'll-miss-it war? It all started when the British, who controlled much of East Africa, wanted a pro-British sultan to rule Zanzibar, a small but strategically important island off the coast of modern-day Tanzania. But when their chosen ruler suddenly died, his successor, Sultan Khalid bin Bargash, took the throne without British approval. The British were not happy. They demanded that Khalid step down, but he refused and barricaded himself inside the Sultan's palace with about 3,000 men. In response, the British assembled a small but incredibly powerful fleet right off the coast of Zanzibar. On the morning of August 27, 1896, the British gave their final warning. When Khalid still refused to surrender, they opened fire. The British fleet bombarded the Sultan's palace with heavy artillery, reducing it to rubble within minutes. Meanwhile, the tiny Zanzibari navy, a single wooden ship, was also sunk almost instantly. The Sultan's forces were no match for modern firepower. Around 500 Zanzibari fighters were killed or wounded, while the British suffered exactly one injury. Realizing he had no chance, Khalid fled the palace and took refuge in the German consulate, where he remained under protection before eventually being exiled. And just like that, the war was over in under 45 minutes. The Anglo-Zanzibar War wasn't just a comically short conflict, it was yet another example of how industrial age firepower could utterly destroy traditional forces in a matter of moments. So, what do all of these battles teach us? If there's one thing history makes clear, it's that warfare is never just about numbers. Time and time again, we've seen smaller, outgunned forces achieve overwhelming victories through superior strategy, better leadership, and sometimes, just sheer bad luck on the part of their enemies. One of the biggest lessons? Strategy matters more than numbers. From the Romans at Watling Street to the English at Agincourt, smaller forces used discipline, terrain, and tactics to defeat much larger armies. Being outnumbered means nothing if your enemy is charging into a trap. Another key factor? Technology changes everything. The Battle of Underdog showed the world that industrial firepower had made traditional warfare obsolete. Machine guns and artillery turned what would have been a massive, hard-fought battle into a one-sided slaughter. And finally, these battles remind us that history repeats itself. The lessons learned at Cannae? They influence military thinking for centuries, inspiring generals from Napoleon to modern strategists. Cold Harbor? It was a brutal demonstration of why blindly charging entrenched positions is a death sentence, a lesson that would be painfully repeated in World War I. So next time someone tells you that the bigger army always wins, point them to history, because as we've seen today, the underdog doesn't just win sometimes, they change the course of history itself. If you enjoyed this breakdown of lopsided battles, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. I post deep dives into some of the most fascinating moments from the past, so if you're into strategy, warfare, or just history in general, you won't want to miss what's coming next. And if you want to see more, check out some of my other videos, I've got plenty more history content for you to explore. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.